We're here today to discuss a very interesting subject with its author, Professor Eric Louw, retired political scientist from the University of Queensland in Brisbane. Good morning, Eric.
Hello.
So we have a very interesting topic today, and we'll start with me just eliciting a description of your thesis. One, Australia is a settler, not a migrant nation. And secondly, that we've switched from under the auspices of the British Empire, Pax Britannica, to the American Empire. Please take it away and lay out your theory.
Right. So, okay. I suppose what I'm arguing is that in Australia, I think almost everybody has now slipped into the language of calling us a migrant nation. The politicians call us a migrant nation all the time, and the media calls us a migrant nation. And so it seems most Australians have just adopted this jargon. Now, I'm saying that the very word migrant nation carries with it baggage. And I would argue strongly that we are not really a migrant nation. I would argue we're a colonial nation. If you look at us historically, if you look at the demographics of Australia, you look at the ancestry of most Australians, the bulk of Australians can trace their ancestry back to the colonial period. There has, of course, been a migrant period. The migrant period, the mass migrant period, really only begins, I suppose, in the 1980s, 1990s, somewhere around about there. And since then, we've had this mass migration. So yes, large numbers of migrants have been introduced, and you could argue that makes us a sort of semi-migrant nation. But even with that, the numbers of those who trace their ancestry back to being migrants, as opposed to colonists, is still not the majority, not even close to the majority. So historically, I would argue we are a colonial nation, not a migrant nation. I think if we use the word colonial nation, I think it's very important. It's important for us to state who we actually are, because the next step from saying we're a colonial nation is actually to defend the colonial nation. Because going along with the migrant nation is the idea that colonialism is bad, the British Empire is bad, history, it's this black armband version of history. It's all a terrible thing. We should all be ashamed of ourselves. Now, I would say that if we start by saying, no, excuse me, I'm a member of a colonial nation, and I don't think there's anything to be embarrassed about that. I am proud of being a member of a colonial nation, and here are the reasons. This is what the colonial nation of Australia has achieved. So that's broadly what my thesis is that there is power in words. I think the left understands that there's power in words. And I think that's why they've adopted migrant nation. Because migrant nation goes together with multiculturalism. It goes together with denationalization. And they know that perfectly well. Whereas if we say, no, we want our roots, we are proud of our roots, this is who we are, then we got something to fight for.
No, it's a very important point. I'm reminded of in the early days of the breakdown of restrictive immigration, which really got underway from about 1970, although it began a few years earlier, technically, but it really got underway during the 70s. And I remember there was this infamous speech by Prime Minister Bob Hawke in 1988 on Australia Day. And his message was, he didn't put it this way, but he was loud and clear, Australia has no ethnic identity apart from Aborigines. Apart from Aborigines. We have no ethnic identity. There's no hierarchy of descents was the term he used. And that's precisely him using the language and developing the rhetoric along the lines that you...
Exactly right. That's where it starts. Yes.
And it's an absolute one. It's simply untrue.
Yep.
It's simply untrue. We had a pronounced ethnic identity, especially if one asked the average Australian,
absolutely,
do you see Britain as somehow a mother country? Well, of course it's the mother country. It's the mother culture.
If you go back and look at old media interviews, it's unambiguous. I mean, certainly until the end of the 1960s, if you talk to the average Australian person in the street, they're British. They know they're British. I mean, they're a colonial nation. They were created by the British, and they see nothing wrong with that. And that only, as you say, the shift takes place during the 70s. I would argue it's because there's a shift in America in the 60s, and I think Australia copies them. And then the politicians latch onto this. And I think the Labour Party, well, ironically, in Australia, the Liberal Party also get in on this act. So it was bipartisan agreement on this in the 70s that Australia was going to shift its identity into this migrant nation stuff. And they've all been pushing it very hard ever since then.
Now, if I can draw out, now let's switch now to the American scene, because this completes your argument. We're talking about the Kennedy and then the Johnson regimes or presidencies.
Yep.
Would you like to take the story from there, from the American side?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the 1960s in America are, of course, absolutely crucial. It's the civil rights era. And it really is driven by the Kennedy, during the Kennedy presidency, this all comes online. And of course, the American Democrat Party pushes this very hard because they are trying to change how Americans see themselves. The initial change in America, and this is something I think the right has to deal with, in fact, is that the change in America is not actually, curiously, a Marxist problem in the 60s. It's a left liberal problem. It's left liberals who push this. And we can, I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons. We can go and look at why they did this. It was the civil rights era, and there seems to have been this curious alliance that emerged between, in those days they were called Negroes, so African Americans. Jewish Americans pushed this very hard, and then left liberal politicians in the Democratic Party pushed this. That was the alliance between those three groups of people who decided they were going to change the way America saw itself. And then and they were very successful. They did indeed. You saw it in the media. The media, if you go back now, I mean, I've been doing this recently. I've gone back and I've looked at old American sitcoms. You know, sitcoms that pretty innocuous. You don't think there's any political content in them at all. But if you look at them now, they had a strong political message. TV programs like Star Trek. I was watching a rerun recently of Bewitched. And who would have thought Bewitched had anything political in? But if you listen to the dialogue, you hear them starting to push that story. So the media are pushing that story together with the politicians. And it then comes together with them actually changing America's migration laws. So we see that. We see the America change its Immigration and Nationality Act, and they abandon the previous policy of having a national origins formula and replace it with this idea that they deliberately want a non-discrimination migration system. I think that's another term we've got to look at very carefully. Our politicians in Australia use it. They've copied the Americans. Both the Americans and the Australians say we have a non-discriminatory migration system. They're terribly proud of this. Well, we have to ask ourselves, what do they mean by this? Why did they introduce this? And why are they so proud of it? And could we question it? I mean, what is so good about it, actually? I mean, it seems to actually cause a lot. If we look at the result of a non-discriminatory migration system, which of course was also copied in Europe. The Europeans also copied the Americans. Wherever this has been implemented, it has produced problems in those societies. And we need to start talking about those problems.
But let's just go back to the, I have two points to make, forming a question.
Yep.
So Kennedy, a centerpiece of President Kennedy's campaign in 1959, 1960. He took office in January 61, I think.
Yep.
A centerpiece was his linking immigration to the civil rights movement, civil rights values.
Yes.
And he actually published a book in the late 50s called A Nation of Immigrants. I think that was the book title. This was the core thesis of the book, was that America actually had no ethnic identity. It just was a nation of immigrants, wherever they came from, and of course who would select immigrants ethnically or racially. I mean, that would be racist, of course.
Absolutely.
So therefore, America has no. Now, it's an accident of history that America was 90% white at that stage, just accident of history. And he came in to the presidency having actually, he didn't write the book; it was ghosted by the ADL. The ADL actually ghosted it for him. So he came in with that, very similar to Bob Hawke's 1988 speech, where he says, actually, we have no ethnic identity. Diversity is our identity.
Exactly.
Diversity. An incoherent nonsense.
And I think we can also track that back to the 1950s United Nations push. And the Americans were at that stage, the United Nations was actually being run, in the 50s, it was still being run by the State Department. And the State Department is filled with left liberal people who push this stuff. And it's their response to the Second World War. They're going, oh my God, look what the Nazis did. We're not going to be racists. And the United Nations pushes very strongly the idea race doesn't exist, apparently. Ethnicity doesn't exist. And if it does, it shouldn't. I mean, we'll make it go away somehow. I mean, this is ideological interventionism on a massive scale. Kennedy is, of course, picking that up and then running with it in 1960s America.
Now, I agree. Now, there's a remaining question. What we're discussing is American domestic policy.
Absolutely.
Why should they weaponize foreign policy to advance those goals? Now, there's something about, is this to do with American exceptionalism? Why would they take their domestic policies and then try and impose them on the rest of the world?
Well, I think that has everything to do with the transfer of power from this Pax Britannica to the Pax Americana. Now, and of course that starts really with the Second World War, but it's a slow iterative process. It's not like on one day. If we want to look for a day when it becomes clear and everybody in the world understands the changes happen, it was the Suez Crisis in 1956. In 1956, from then on, it's unambiguous that America runs the world, not the British. And of course that changes everything. But we have to look at this shift to the Pax Americana, because the British run a formal empire. Now, formal empire means you actually annex the territory and you send your own colonial administrators and policemen to the colony, and then you administer the laws that you make to fix the place up, if you like. The Americans don't do that. And in fact, there's a long debate in America. We won't go into that now, but there was a long debate in America in the early 20th century by Woodrow Wilson saying, should we Americans adopt the European British model of imperialism, or should we adopt a different model? And Woodrow Wilson was the guy who said, let's not do the European formal empire. Let's do our own informal empire. So, and there's a lot of stuff written on informal empires and how they work. The gist of an informal empire is that you don't annex territory. You run your empire. I mean, there's no question the Americans run a global empire, but they don't control the territory in the way the Brits or the Europeans did. They do it through indirect methods. They do it through multilateralism and what they call a rules-driven or a rules-ordered global system. But the rules are written by the Americans. That's how they run. So it's a foreign policy issue, but actually it's a way you control the empire. Now, if you think about it, if you don't actually run your empire the way the Brits did, one of your key problems is how do you get those people in those different bits of your empire to implement policies that you want? It's a problem. I mean, they don't have to do it. They technically have sovereignty. They can tell you to bugger off. And once in a while, of course, we see they do. And then America puts pressure on them and sanctions and forces them to come back into the fold and behave themselves. Now, the way you do it, the way you run the Pax Americana, is that you have to change the way people see themselves and the world. And the Americans put enormous energy into that. They call it democratization. Democratization is a catch-all term for, we're going to make all of you guys like us. You will all become little Americans. So one of the curious things is people always argue that the British Empire was nasty because it went out there and it bullied people and made them all conform and become British. And I argue, actually, if you look at how the British ran their empire compared to how the Americans ran theirs, the American empire is much harsher. It's much more stringent. And it has to be. They've got to make you. America has, for decades, turned us into Yankees. We must all think like Americans. Because if we think like Americans, they don't have to tell us to do it anymore, do they? We'll just do it for them. And so it is that democratization process. It's the education system. It's the media system. It's through changing how we perceive the world to see it like they do. The Brits never had to do that. So if you go back to British India, you see that the British had parts of India that were indeed British, but other parts of the British Empire were left alone. You could be Indian, and you weren't forced to be British. You could choose, did you want to cross the line into the British bit, or did you want to stay in the Indian bit? So that means that if you're an Indian, you could carry on being an Indian in the British Empire if you wanted. The Americans don't allow you that.
I suppose the Americans were aided in this by exporting culture. They had popular culture. They had
all about
huge
culture.
export industry.
Absolutely.
I remember the first news report on Australian television in the 1950s. It began, "Here is the news."
Yep.
It was an American accent.
Absolutely. Well, if you just listen to the news every day, I mean, you ask yourself, why are we hearing so much about America? I mean, there can be something that'll happen in Los Angeles, and I'm supposed to hear about it. I go, why? Well, I'd much rather hear about something in Perth. It's got much more to do with me than something in Los Angeles. And yet, if you listen to it, you'd think we all live in America. You'd think we live in California, basically.
Really, an extension of their cultural zone.
And it's not interesting. Just there, it's across the globe. It's wherever you go.
And it's interesting, your earlier comments you were talking about how cultural elites help develop and empower this civil rights movement. Well, the same cultural elites are exporting popular culture around the world.
Well, if you think about it, they have a vested interest in it because those American elites, it's their job. They are paid to do this. I mean, they literally, they build careers through building this informal empire, through promoting this cultural export to the world. I mean, that's what they're doing. And a lot of them get very rich on doing it.
Yeah, it's lucrative.
It's very lucrative for them, yes.
Let's jump, because this is the big topic. What can Australia do about it?
Yeah.
It's not just a matter of waving your hands and going, abracadabra, we are now free. These are power structures, power connections that we're talking about. Imagine, let's do a mental experiment. Imagine that Australia did do that and it said, from now on, we're going to reassert our historic nation-building restrictive immigration policy, or something like it. We actually have an ethnic history, and of course individual rights will be protected, but we're going to favour the collective rights of Australia's original culture and so on. I think America would come down on us like a ton of bricks.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Ton of bricks.
But it doesn't. Okay, but you have to be strategic. You have to work out what are you going to do here. Curiously, I mean, I would flip that around and say, yes, that's true. We're an American surrogate state, have been since the 1950s. And there's no way of escaping that. I mean, they have the power, and we have a choice. Do we want to be an American surrogate state or a Chinese surrogate state? Well, I'll go with the Americans, basically. But you see, the point is that there's also a strength in this for us, and it's something Australians do have that other parts of the empire might not have. You see, we are Anglos, and I would argue so are they. At the heart of the American nation is an American colonial nation that's Anglo. They share the same history as us to a large extent. Yes, it diverged at a certain point, but nonetheless, we do share that Anglo-ness. And the Anglo world does work as a kind of global entity now. There's no question. We all know what's going on in all other parts of the Anglo world all the time, and we're all sharing the same culture, the same media. We talk to each other as if we are all part of the same culture, because we are. Now, I think that's the level of the struggle. I think that we have to take the language on. We have to actually start saying, it's taking on that battle about the nature of colonialism. We have to say it's not a bad thing to be a colonialist. Colonialism is not a bad thing. The British Empire created America. That's not a bad thing. It turned out to be a really good thing. The Americans colonized North America, and then they colonized Australia. They colonized many places. These are not bad things, and we have to challenge those people that say they are. Why are we just let it ride? We just let it happen. When people say this is evil, but it's very easy to build an argument to say no, it's not. Of course, bad things were done during the imperial period. There is not a single state in the world, whatever it is, whether it's left, right, or center, that is 100% good or 100% bad. It's always a curious mixture between these things. So, of course, bad things happen. Bad things happen in every single state and throughout history. It's always been like that. But good things also happen. And on balance, I would argue that European colonialism was a good thing, not a bad thing.
I think
That's what we have to argue.
I think that's a good argument, very good argument for changing and imposing our rhetoric instead of our opponent's rhetoric.
And we can do
Very
that.
wise.
It's not just a battle in Australia. We can just as easily make that an American battle.
Yeah.
Because there are people in America who will pick up on this. Or we should be doing it within the whole Anglo world. There are people in Britain who will pick up on this. And we should all work together and say, no, we're not going to accept this anymore.
Yeah. It seems to me that an underlying problem with your argument, it's not yet fatal, but it's going in a fatal direction, is the diversification, the ethno-cultural diversification of our two countries. We are moving apart. So as we diversify, we're becoming Chinese and Indian heavy.
Yep.
They're becoming African and East Asian heavy. But that's at the descriptive level of diversity. There's also a power dimension.
Yes.
And it's my view that the traditional ethnic hierarchy of both our colonial societies, with basically the colonial peoples on top, it's an informal ethnic hierarchy. It was always was.
True, that's right. Yes.
Individual rights,
Yes.
apart from the slavery situation, were always guaranteed. But it was an informal cultural hegemony enjoyed. Now, that was basically lost around World War II, 1950. By then, a different, I call it a minority ethnic hierarchy was forming. Again, informal and didn't always work out that way, but multiculturalism is an expression, in my view, of minority power within, or dominance, hegemony, within an ethnic hierarchy. So here's the problem. We need to assert ourselves as groups, and hopefully jointly, as you've suggested, in America as well as Australia. We need to assert ourselves and say, hold on, excuse us, we're still here.
Yeah,
we have a voice. We have a few votes. We actually have a few votes to cast around. We've got vast resources. We need to exert ourselves as a culture, in both places, because we've been outgunned.
Absolutely.
We've been blown out of the water, actually.
Well, we've been blown out of the water because we accepted their language.
Yeah.
And once we accepted their language, we lost. It was just all over then. If we go back to the idea of, we can actually revisit not just the Australian colonial nation, but the American colonial nation. I mean, the history of American colonial nation is fascinating because, yes, it was the British credit, but of course, many European states created colonies in America. So, in fact, if we look at the origins of the American colonial nation, at heart it is British. At the very core, it is British. However, there's two, and this, by the way, is very much the reason you have the northern states and the southern states, because the mixes were different. So, in fact, if you look at the settlers in the southern states, they nearly all derive from what are now called Scottish Irish.
Scotch Irish.
Yeah, I mean, so they that kind of British thing, and there was very little admixture from anything else. Whereas in the north, the mixture was, and it comes from the states of, so it's New England, Virginia, what was New Holland, and Delaware, which was Swedish. Now, and then you also had the Amish in Pennsylvania. So you had Northern Europeans settled there. You know, the very word Yankee illustrates the American nation brilliantly. I don't know if you know where Yankee comes from.
No.
It's fascinating. Yankee comes, okay, it actually is, it's from the New Holland thing, from New Amsterdam. It turns out that in the Dutch colony of what became New York, one of the most common names was a name called Jan Kiers. Jan Kiers was a very common Dutch name in New Amsterdam. And people from all other parts of America called people from the northern states in America Yankees, which is Jan Keersers. Isn't that fascinating?
Hmm.
See, the Dutch stopped being Dutch. They became British. After New York was annexed to the British Empire, all those Dutch guys just got merged into that British Anglo nation, as did the Swedish guys in Delaware. So, yes, there was a multiplicity, but at the end they became Anglos.
Also, it was a different type of British in the north to the south. The
It
south, you correctly,
was.
I
It
think,
was.
characterized. In the north, they were more Puritan. In fact, the initial colony in early 1600s was a Puritan colony, so heavily flavoured. While in the south, it was less so, much less so. Tend to be Scots-Irish.
Yes, and but it's curious how you see. How many people know about the history of American colonialism? Not many people can have a discussion about that even anymore. We've lost all that. Our children don't learn about history. I'm horrified. My children went to school and never learned history. They should. And I think, in fact, in the Anglo world, we should actually know. I would like my children to know Australian colonial history, American colonial history, New Zealand colonial history, all of it.
Absolutely.
Because it's all part of one package.
For example,
then we understand it differently.
My impression is that most Americans don't understand their own colonial history.
Exactly.
For example, the leading role played by Britain with projected power via its navy, protecting the colonies, the original 13 colonies, negotiating wars, outcome of wars, for example, with the Spanish and so on. There was a tremendous Indian uprising armed by the French, for example, shortly before 1776, before the breakaway began. That Britain sacrificed itself. It defended those colonies. And just a little while later, the colonies said, "No, we're off. We're off."
In fact, the curious thing is it happens because America imposes a tax to pay for the war when Britain defended the colonies against the French. It was the French Indian uprising. But, that's right. So the British were paying to defend the colonies. And when they said, guys, we think you should share the costs of this war, that caused the Boston Tea Party and voila. So there's the irony in it all.
Yeah. My own view is it was simply local elites wanting to run their own affairs. Completely understandable. But there was no noble justification for it apart from we want local rule.
That's right.
Fair enough.
Absolutely.
They learnt their lesson by the time Australia came along, and they began to proactively grant local rule
to stop that happening.
To stop that happening. It was interesting. Okay, is there anything else? Any other part of your thesis that we should be discussing? Because it's a really rich. You've also generated these tables with a comparison of Pax Americana and Pax Britannica. Would you like to talk a bit about those comparisons?
Yeah, well, it's look, I stumbled across this by accident when I was writing a book many years ago, which is called the Roots of the Pax Americana. And it didn't actually start as a book looking at the roots of the Pax Americana. I was looking at something else, but I discovered I needed to understand where the Pax Americana came from. So I needed to look at the history of it. So that I went back and looked at the history of it. And yes, you see, and amongst other things, what I ended up doing in the book is I looked at that difference between a formal empire and an informal empire. And so I spent a lot of time looking at that difference and how an informal empire has to be harsher, curiously, than a formal empire. But the other thing is, it's that change, that moment of change is what I think we need to spend much more time thinking about. So America wins the Second World War, effectively. The British effectively lose the Second World War.
In effect.
I think they win, but they lose that war to the Americans. The Americans beat everybody in the Second World War. It takes them the 1950s to implement that victory. So what we see then is that's the change that we have to look at. We need to go back and say, let's start, if you go back to the beginning of the 1950s, we have to look at how did people who had been in the British Empire, Anglos, so people in Britain, in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, how did they see themselves? And they saw themselves as these British colonials, of which they were proud. And there was a whole bunch of values tied to those things. And they were all values that served the way the empire ran the empire. If we look at all of those, and I drew up a table showing all of the values, let's call it all the values, if you like, from the early 1950s. And then I look at all the values that we have now, which are the values that happen to serve the Pax Americana. They are literally opposites. Literally opposites. So one of the key ones that I'll just throw up straight away is the idea of race. So America has this problem with race because of African Americans and the slavery thing. They've got this huge guilt trip about slavery. And so Americans have battled with this issue of race. They don't know what to do. They still don't know what to do about it. And because of that, one of the things that the Pax Americana does is it says race is a bad thing. We must get rid of race. We must get rid of ethnicity. Indeed, we must get rid of nationalism because it's a bad thing. They don't like any of those things. So that is a huge shift, because if we go back and look at the British Empire, it's the exact opposite of that. The British didn't think race was a problem. They didn't think race hierarchy was a problem. They didn't think everybody was the same, nor should they be the same. The British thought diversity was a good thing, and the way they ran their empire was to encourage diversity. They didn't make everybody turn out like them. That's just one massive shift. Now we have to ask, well, how does that come about? How do you change from race is an okay thing and diversity is a good thing to this thing we have now where we're a migrant nation and we must all get together, or we must just merge together into one blob, which is what the Americans push. And it's that transition we need to look at. And that transition happens. It's bubbling along in the 50s. You can see they're trying to put the stuff into place. The ideas are being put into place. But in the 1950s, it's an intellectual exercise. It's the intellectuals trying to generate these ideas. It's popularized in the 60s in the Kennedy administration. That's why the Kennedy administration becomes so important, because the Kennedy administration takes all of those ideas that the intellectuals had developed in the 50s and institutionalizes them and popularizes them. And then from the 60s onwards, they just become the new norm.
What you're saying implies that before World War II, the Pax Americana was a very different animal, because the ideological shift, especially in higher education and the new popular media, American television began around 1948, 47, 48, which was an outgrowth of the Hollywood studios system, actually created American network TV. So what you're implying is that this is historically a fairly recent phenomenon.
It's very, very, very recent.
Because
very
America
recent.
had conservative views on race before World War II.
Of course, exactly right. I mean, it's fascinating to go and look at that. Look, America before the Second World War, there wasn't a Pax Americana. What you had before the Second World War, America became economically very powerful, and powerful enough to challenge the British Empire round about the year 1900. That's when it's sort of like where we are with China now. China now has suddenly become powerful enough to say, excuse me, we're not just going to listen to you guys anymore. We're going to tell you what we think now. And so we realize the Chinese are on the march, right? America went through that phase around about 1900. And it was the Woodrow Wilson era when that happened, which is why Woodrow Wilson was the guy who developed all these ideas. And that's why back then he realized America could build a Pax Americana. America was not capable of building its own empire. And so he asked the question, should we do it? And if we do it, how do we do it? Okay. And the only places where they adopted the European model of imperialism and colonialism was in the Philippines.
Yeah.
And they did it there, and then they quickly backed down and said, no, we think it's a bad idea. And they shifted to the other model. So, and because the other thing, between the First and the Second World Wars, Britain and America were not buddies. I mean, they were really going for it. Because what was happening between the First and Second World Wars, America was now powerful enough to set up its own empire. And as they went out around the world trying to do this, and in fact, the place they were interested in was China. America wanted China for theirs. And as they went into Asia and tried to do this, they found that wherever they went, the Brits had got there first. The Brits are really good. They always found the best places, and they just parked themselves off there. And so wherever the Americans went, there were the Brits already going, hello, excuse me, we're already here. And so that's why Roosevelt's team ultimately say, we have to take the British Empire down. That's their agenda in the Second World War. If you go look back now at what the State Department was saying and planning in the 1930s and 1940s, that is what they were saying. Roosevelt went on record as saying, beating Germany and Japan won't be a problem. Beating the British is going to be the problem because they're powerful and they're in the way. And until we do that, we have got nothing. And the whole Second World War was geared toward not just beating Japan and Germany as they wanted to do, but to take it further and to knock out the Brits as well, which they achieved.
The Roosevelt years, close to 12 years, he almost served 3 terms.
Yeah.
These were a critical transition point around World War II, just 30s through the end of World War II, and it was a transition regime. Absolutely. But what was happening in the background was a profound shift in elite culture. I'm talking about the big universities, Princeton, all the private ones, and most of the quality state universities were shifting. Now, the best study I've read on this is Eric Kaufman, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, his book. And he argues the process of left liberal takeover of the universities was basically complete, depending on which discipline you were looking at, American history or sociology, basically by 1950. By World War II, basically it was finished then. So this then was providing values for the politicians to follow. And that shifted profoundly over a 50-year period, culminating in World War, from about 1900 through. So that's happening in the background, and I think I want to add this to your thesis, actually, that the same was happening in Australia. Why? But delayed. Why? Because these disciplines are organised globally. These are Western-wide disciplines, whether it be sociology or English literature and so on, history, and also the STEM subjects as well. They're all globally organised. So combine that with the fact that America had this huge preponderance of output at the universities in publishing, in scientific discoveries, in innovation, and so on, and the effect was natural. They were basically imposing their values or leading other countries, especially other Anglosphere countries, in their direction. So it can be viewed as from an elite perspective as well, I think, and it does make sense.
Absolutely. And I think it takes place both just through that natural osmosis, as you'd expected. The ideas would just flow globally through the Anglo world. But in the case of the change of the universities, and indeed also the change of the media, but let's just look at the universities for now, there was also some deliberate intervention, which Roosevelt engineered. And one of the key places that he used to do this, he set up, it was called the Office of, oh my gosh, I can't remember now. It was their propaganda, the Army's propaganda operation, their communication operations guys. And they targeted academics in the 1940s. And they set up black propaganda operations. Now, in Britain, one of the key black propaganda operation sites was Chatham House, which still exists. And Chatham House was set up as an American propaganda operation to target academics to do exactly what you're saying. How do we get them to buy into this value system that we want? He stated it unambiguously. If we can get the British intellectual class to think that the empire is evil, we've won. And that's what they were doing through Chatham House. And of course, Chatham House still pushes that line. It's never stopped pushing that line. It was
they probably supported the Atlantic Charter, which Britain was forced to sign by.
Exactly.
Which was really radical. Actually, it's quite anti-colonialist.
Yes. And so on. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Churchill was told, don't sign this. Under any circumstances, don't go near it. It's a disaster.
Mm.
And he got strong armed basically. If you want Lend-Lease, dude, say no, like you're going to go along with us or not.
Yeah. There was tremendous flow of munitions from
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
United States.
And it was made quite clear to him, if we don't help you, you go down, and we will actually let you go down if you don't do this.
Well, 1948, you had Indian independence.
Yep.
And you had and then by the 60s, it was happening right across Africa.
Yeah, if you look at the State Department documentation, the Pax Americana book, I kind of go through this whole story. I track it all out, and America was really interested in Asia. They say so. They say Asia is where we want our informal empire to be. We're not interested in Africa. We're not at that stage. Ironically, they weren't even that interested in the Middle East, or they eventually changed their mind because of the oil. But the places that actually interested them were three places: China, India, Indonesia. That's what the Americans wanted. And so after the Second World War, that's where they put their energy straight away. And they it was really harsh. So in the case of the Dutch, the Dutch go back to Indonesia after the Second World War. And when the Dutch go back, the Americans use the Marshall Plan against them. And they say, if we withdraw our aid to you now, because, Holland had literally been flooded. They'd opened the sluice gates and there was sea again. And he said, if you want us they were starving, if you want us to stop you starving and rebuild your country, you get out of Indonesia right now. Like by that date. Or otherwise, we're going to pull the plugs on you guys. Very harsh. And the Brits saw them do this to the Dutch and went, oops, these guys are serious. And that's when they realized, when they tell us we have to get out of India, they really mean we have to get out of India.
The French struggled on independently in Vietnam.
Yep. The French and the Portuguese.
They struggled on, and in 1954 they lost it.
Yeah. There's fascinating correspondence between de Gaulle and Salazar in Portugal about the empires and about these bloody Yankees. They were so angry with them about the Yankees trying to drive us out of our empires and saying, and the correspondence is fascinating because they go, at some point, the elite in America will wake up and come to their senses and realize how stupid this is, and then it'll all be okay. We just got to hold on long enough for them to realize how stupid this all is. But in the end, that didn't happen. So.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating thesis, and I recommend it's been published. It's a short article published in the Richardson Post. So I recommend that you look it up. It's an online journal, Richardson Post. I think the title is Immigration. You gave it, Eric, and so I recommend that to the public. And thanks very much for coming along today. I think we should do this more often when we publish something.
I think the title was, Is Australia a Migrant Nation or a Colonial Nation? I think that was the title, something like that.
Excellent.
Okay.
And thank you very much for the interview.